economic downturn is here. We are back to square one. The IMF has warned that major economic powerhouses would suffer an economic decline in 2023. And the war in Ukraine, rising inflations, and COVID lockdowns in China would bring the global economy to its knees. The collapse has begun. But this time, it is different and even worse than the 2008 housing crash. In this video, we will be talking about the incoming recession, how it is different from the 2008 Wall Street crisis, and how it will change the entire generation. But before moving further, we would like you to subscribe to our channel to support our work. What's a recession? Our newspaper headlines have been flooded with the word recession, especially in the latter part of 2022. But have you ever wondered what exactly recession means? There's no official definition of recession. But economists say that when we experience 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, it's a recession. By this definition, we are already in a recession. But GDP is not the only metric to gauge an economic collapse. We also need to look at unemployment rates, global supply chains, inflation rates, and the housing market. And that's why these current indicators are sending alarm bells. And thus, we are sleepwalking to another disaster. But before understanding the incoming crisis, we want to take you back to America's Lehman moment, the 2008 housing crisis. For many, the images of publicly shamed bankers and crime people losing their houses are fresh. It all started with a housing bubble, a real estate market that was geared towards high mortgage influx. The financial players got greedy and started handing loans to those who did not have the capacity to repay. It was sort of a Ponzi scheme. And ultimately, borrowers could not pay back, which eventually paralyzed banks and dismantled America's banking system. The government then intervened and bailed out the banks. But what happened in the US did not remain in the US. European banks dependent on the US crumbled like a house of cards. The crisis grappled every part of the globe, leading to a shocking recession. A question now emerges: how the current looming crisis is different from the 2008 Great Depression. Let's delve into this. The current economic shock. While the shortage of money caused the previous economic downturn, this time money is not the issue. In fact, banks have loads of money. But this time, they cannot spend it. And here's why. When COVID-19 hit hard, it disrupted the global supply chains. Factories came to a halt, which brought the global demand-supply system to a standstill. And as countries were coming out from strict lockdowns back to normal, demand for goods and services outstripped supply. This caused price hikes ranging from energy hikes to food instability. Well, as major economies were grappling with volatility, Russia, the elephant in the room, invaded Ukraine, putting the final nail in the coffin. When Russia attacked Ukraine, hardly anyone had an idea what that would do to the global world. And here's the puzzle. Ukraine is a major supplier of global sunflower oil, maize, barley, and other basic commodities. On the other hand, Russia is a major provider of global fertilizer. This ultimately had a dual effect. The war caused food shortages and price hikes for essential commodities. If we take the example of the US, agricultural products in the country became expensive as the US imports wheat and fertilizer from abroad. The price of eggs, butter, and chicken increased by up to 30%. But this inflation galloped, having a snowball effect on the economy, which compelled the Fed to intervene. Fed and inflation. In the early part of 2022, US inflation reached a breathtaking proportion. And that was largely due to geopolitical realities, the post-pandemic world, and the trade war with China. So the Fed jumped in and decided to increase the interest rates to check inflation, which initially seemed a good move. But in the medium to long run, halted economic activity and stifled economic growth. On top of that, in the latter half of 2022, 12,000 kilometers to the east of the US, China announced a policy that was about to shake the world. The Omicron virus hampered the backbone of the Chinese economy. The start-stop policy did not bear fruit. So then it decided to completely ban all public movement in a quest to follow the zero COVID policy. Zero COVID became disastrous for the Chinese economy. For the first time since 1989, Beijing signaled it may miss its annual growth target of 5.5%, in part because of its COVID restrictions. And well, keep that in mind that this occurred at a time when the Chinese housing bubble burst. Evergrande, the real estate tycoon, went out of cash. So the construction industry almost went broke. Together, zero COVID policy and the Chinese housing collapse nosedived the global economy and paralyzed other interconnected economies. Australia, which was the major exporter of coal to China, had to look towards alternative markets amid lockdowns in Beijing. Similarly, South Korea, Japan, and Malaysia all suffered from a lackluster Chinese economy. And the US was also not immune from all this. In fact, Apple and Starbucks were the major sufferers. COVID-19 related challenges significantly impacted the supply of iPhone 14 Pro and iPhone 14 Pro Max and lasted through most of December, causing ship times to stretch. Likewise, Starbucks suffered a 30% dropdown in sales due to harsh COVID restrictions. Apple or Starbucks might still be able to sustain the economic pressures, but the present and coming generation might not be able to endure the recession. Generation in crisis. The crisis is still far from over, as IMF now predicts a recession. That will eventually impact our generations. Take America as a case study. The Federal Reserve wants massive layoffs, as evident by their recent rate hike, and won't stop until inflation falls and the labor market is truly in a recession. This will change a generation, those who graduated college in 2008 or later, as many will end up copying their parents and grandparents and take on jobs they never wanted in order to simply make ends meet. And that's not just it. Economists even predict that getting a house in the US is a pipe dream for many. On top of that, renting a house is another nightmare in this high interest rate driven economy. That puts younger Americans in a tight spot. The only recessions they've lived through are the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s, the financial sector meltdown of the late 2000s, and the COVID crash. Even more shocking is that millennials and Gen Zers don't have much faith in the economy right now. According to a Deloitte survey of 14,808 Gen Zers and 8,412 millennials, just 28% expect the country's economic situation to improve over the next 12 months. And if the recession did not stop, then more Americans will live paycheck to paycheck. Most of them would be middle class. Entire generational wealth would evaporate with no end in sight, and Europe would be no different. But there got to be some way to avoid this crisis, or maybe a way to navigate the coming turbulent times. Let's listen to some words of wisdom from Charlie Munger. Well, Munger thinks that you don't want to be a gambler and need to invest in a limited and smart way. Moderation is the key. As for countries, they need to bring supply chains closer to home to avoid price hikes and disruptions. There's no doubt that a recession is inevitable this year. And this is not because of one event. In fact, it was brewing for years. First, the pandemic wreaked havoc. Then the Russian invasion of Ukraine caused food shortages and price hikes. But well, this current crisis is different from the 2008 housing crash. That one was a money problem. And today's problems are rooted in more economic inactivity and structural issues. This dilemma would definitely impact the young generation that would not be able to get their dream house or student loans. It is still very difficult to predict the exact date of the recession. But when it will come, it will cause damage of unimaginable scale. The Fed keeps on increasing the interest rates, but that's not doing good as the war in Ukraine continues along with economic stagnation in China. Dark times await. Let's see what 2023 would do to our economic landscape. If you like our content, do subscribe to our channel for more economic updates. Let me know in the comment section what you think about the recession.